our first pitch with GridMarkets from Malaysia.
Two. Hi everyone, my name is Echelon. I'm one of the founders of GridMarkets. As it says here, our goal is to economically expedite computationally intensive problems. But what are these computationally intensive problems that we're talking about? Well, this is a selection of one of simply maybe hundreds of use cases that require large amounts of CPU power. When I say large amounts, I mean hundreds, if not thousands, of servers. And the demand for this kind of capacity is expanding exponentially. How fast? Well, you've heard of Moore's Law. I'm going to introduce you to Shrek's Law. As you can see, each Shrek movie made 3 years apart, required twice the processing power of the previous one, except for Shrek, the last one, which required 25% more again, because it was in 3D. Now, if we were to keep going and get to Shrek 7 by the end of the decade, and let's assume by then we were going to be watching movies at 48 frames a second, like The Hobbit and a 4K resolution, this would require a whopping 16 billion core hours of processing power. Now, DreamWorks used almost 20,000 state-of-the-art CPU cores to produce Shrek 4. But this would mean 16 billion core hours would require 50,000 state-of-the-art cores working all day, every day, will still take them 3.7 years to make that movie. Now, why does this seem to be a problem? Well, the thing is, for large firms, they may have the technical know-how and the operational capability to be able to manage this kind of risk. However, it's still an economic one, and it still affects their time to market. But for smaller firms, this is practically a barrier to entry. And this is true, as I mentioned, across over 100 different use cases in multiple geographies globally and multiple industries. So what could be the global demand for this kind of computationally intensive capacity? Well, we think it's in the region of about $100 billion, doubling every 3 to 5 years. So how do we satisfy this sort of insatiable demand? Well, here's the irony of it. The fact is that more than 90% of all the server capacity in the world is completely underutilized. In fact, the Uptime Institute estimates that 54% of servers are utilized only an unbelievable 0.6% of the time. And since 90% of data center power consumption is used to power these idling computers, the fact is that this excess capacity can be made available at minimal cost. But so far, there's been no way to actually marry this insatiable appetite with this abundant supply, until now. GridMarkets is a private B2B market for excess CPU capacity. What does this mean? Well, basically, the sellers own and operate the machines, and they only provide that excess capacity. So for us, we can basically get that capacity at zero capital cost, and it's because there's so much of it, there's practically an unlimited supply of it. The buyers obtain that capacity, but only for the actual usage of it. So that means that the time that their applications run on those CPU cores. So what does that mean for them? It means it's available to them at a fraction of the normal cost from, so for example, public clouds. And there's no minimum commitment in terms of what they need to consume with respect to that. How does it work? Well, regardless of how the sellers actually have their machines, so whether they own them, whether they rent them, or whether they use a public, private, or hybrid cloud, and I might add that in fact cloud providers are some of our best customers, because to provide elastic capacity, they have to have the machines on all the time. But what we do is we provide a secure platform. So this isn't IaaS, this is PaaS, that allows buyers to very simply submit their jobs and their data to us. We go and run that on the excess capacity and bring back their results and just bill them for it. And obviously compensate the sellers for that usage. So what are the benefits? So for sellers, basically they get to monetize a rapidly depreciating asset. So this is effectively free money for them. For buyers, it's even more interesting because they save significant money and time. And that is more than just about actually saving money. It's about being able to do more complex things, more complex models, larger problems, and ultimately increase the productivity of their creative types and their knowledge workers. We're already a global business. This represents a sample of the pipeline and some of the actual signed-up customers that we have on multiple continents. And the management team is composed of a number of relatively old guys. I think we're relatively the dinosaurs of this competition. But between us, we have managed budgets of over 200 million, generated revenue, recurring revenue of over 30 million, and even been the CTO of a $7 billion market cap company. We've accomplished a lot to date. So in August of 2011, we filed a patent. We did a proof of value shortly afterwards. We got some seed funding last year, and very importantly, we had a watershed. And at the end of last year, we actually have signed contracts. And what does that mean? That means we actually have institutions that have signed contracts and agreed terms and payment conditions to exchange the CPU capacity with each other. We just recently did a soft launch, and we're hoping to go into a full launch very shortly, and for which we will be receiving some more angel investment. But we have a very strong pipeline of potential customers, and so we are looking for investors and engineers. So if you have any of these skills, we would like to hear from you. Thank you.
Judges, do you have any questions?
I'm just kind of curious, how do you plan on acquiring your customers, since you're a B2B, both customers and I guess the buyer, sellers, how are you doing that?
At the moment, it's really through a direct sales channel. Clearly, to establish some level of credibility and capability, we have to build the trust initially that this is a service that they'd like to subscribe to. Now, having said that, as we move forward, certainly what we hope to do, and certainly from a seller perspective, is move to more of a procurement sales model and have it more kind of almost self-provisioned. I don't know that we're quite at full self-provisioning. And then for buyers, it still continues to be slightly a bit of a consultative sale, because obviously the way that buyers use capacity, the way that they move to the cloud, it sort of varies on a buyer-to-buyer basis. But that in itself represents a new revenue stream in itself.
I'm not an expert in this area, so pardon my ignorance in me asking the questions. Is someone like an Amazon Web Services or Google a competitor or not a competitor, and why?
They are not a competitor. In fact, as I mentioned, cloud providers are potentially very good suppliers of capacity. And in fact, our first two suppliers, one of them is in managed hosting, and the other is a cloud provider. And as I mentioned, it's because they have to have the machines running all the time, so they actually have an enormous amount of excess capacity. But very important, just to kind of clarify that point, is we are a secondary market for capacity. They are a primary market for capacity. And if you believe that cloud computing facilitates the creation of a commodity market for compute capacity, like every other commodity in the world, there is a secondary market for it, just like there is a primary market for any other.
How do you address concerns around safety?
Security. Okay, so the security question is answered with, there's three aspects to it. Firstly, there's obviously a technical, and as I mentioned, our platform, what it basically does is segregates buyers and sellers. So it's not as though the buyers actually have access to the seller's environment. And similarly, there are safeguards with respect to the use of virtualization and encryption and so forth that make sure that sellers don't actually get access to the IP of the buyers. The second aspect is legal, and as I mentioned, this is a very important part of our model, is actually having a legal agreement that makes it clear. It's not just our agreement with our clients, it's actually their agreement on how they will trade with each other, including accepting all the warranties and liabilities and things like that. But the third aspect, which is actually in many ways the most important aspect, is that we're a private market for B2B, is capacity. And what that means is it's effectively like a country club, if you will, of trusted players who can choose to trade with each other. So much like any other stock exchange or commodities exchange, you choose your counterparty, you decide who you're going to deal with. And as such, the reputational risk and of being in this community is what really kind of holds it together.
Thank you. I think that will be our last question. Thank you very much.